All right. Good day, folks. Thanks for coming to Finding the Warmth of Our Sun. I'm Matthew Brown, your host here at Madison365. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Stitcher, and Apple Podcasts, and of course, the website of Madison365.com. Thanks for coming this week. We're running a good amount of news. We'll be getting to that, covering some things that have went down, and there's a really interesting meta study on incarceration. I'll be doing that next week, next time. But today, I'm going to be talking about the myth of Black Confederates. Read this book from historian Kevin Levin, Searching for Black Confederates. It's a good book. You should read it. No, it's a really interesting book. It's actually a pretty quick read. There's about 180 or so pages of content before he's got quite a bit of on sources and bibliography. Quite a lot on. He's got like 30 plus 40 pages of sources, right? Like it's a well-researched book. That's what I want to say. It's very well-researched. It pulls from bibliography, like basically other books people have written. He pulls from primary sources. So we're talking about things that were written during the Confederacy, or I should say during the Confederate revolt against the United States to create a slave state, as well as the rise of during the Lost Cause myth. So you're talking about stuff written down in people's journals. You're talking about stuff written down in newspapers at the time. We're talking about stuff written down in legislators, whatever. You know, the little books that people write down and one thing. Sorry about that, folks. And accounting and pension records and arguments, primary sources. So part of this and why the primary sources are important is there's a thing people like to do when it comes with history, and that is when we look back upon something, we project our own lenses, our own wills, our own whatever onto it. A lot of people do this. We're in our own ways all guilty of this. This is more than just the judging people by, we can't judge those based upon our standards. It's not about the judging people on our standards. It's us not looking at something through their lens and instead through our lens. It's more than just standards and morality. It's about understanding how they observed and saw the world as they're interacting with it. That's the key right there. And what we saw with this, and spoiler, for those that are going to be reading the book, there are no Black Confederate soldiers. Well, maybe one, but this guy that he found is an absolute outlier, and is really the only one that seems to have been documented as being a soldier. But through all this stuff, he found one black person, one slave who may have been called a soldier, may have had documentation of picking up a rifle in a battle. But of some of the 4,000 plus, or black folks in the Confederate Army, and they were in the Confederate Army, they weren't soldiers. There weren't black regiments. They weren't armed. They didn't participate in the battle per se. They may have been, in the rear. They may have cooked food, cleaned. They were camp servants. They played aspects of medics and logistical support. They were the logistical support of the Confederacy. The slave wing of the Confederate Army was their logistical support. That's what they were. So what all the documentation is. There were really, we're talking about kind of three layers of this, of camp servants. Because that's the holistic answer of that. Of camp servants. So you had individual camp slaves of sorts. So these were slaves that came along with their masters as they enrolled in the army and were the personal servants of these white men. and they may have helped out elsewhere in the camp and performed other camp duties, but they were primarily the servant of these white men. They were brought along to bring status as well as a little bit of their home life, right? They these white men couldn't imagine life without a slave. Tells you a lot. There's interesting aspects to this, and he works through some very interesting narratives of how these relationships evolved as the war went on. And these were complicated relationships. We might want to project something onto them that we might feel, but in essence, these were very complicated relationships. The barriers of slavery, or the barriers of that these white men were placing in seeing these black men as less than human, were kind of slowly breaking down for them as the war dragged on, but never fully broke down. And in fact, they found ways to see these men as both more than human, yet refused to as more than they did before, but still refused to grant them their full humanity. These men also couldn't imagine that these slaves of theirs would actually want to be free. They believed in this idea of the loyal slave, the loyalty about it. And they couldn't imagine when slaves start to escape, particularly as the war dragged on, they couldn't reconcile these things. They couldn't reconcile these facts. Now, not all slaves escaped. And think about it this way, even if you were offered the chance. Think about having to leave your life behind. And escaping was a big choice in real ways. And oftentimes their masters or the masters' families were the only way that these predominantly black men could reach their families again. So if they left the person that was that owned them legally, they may not see their family again. They had to leave everything behind. That's a big choice. Also, you have to leave everything behind that you knew in your life. They were slaves since birth. That's a monumental choice. It's scary. It's fearful. It becomes easy to stay with what you know instead of go with the unknown. Even if you might want freedom, it might seem like too much of a risk. But some also may have had a strange sense of loyalty. I mean, the psychology around not just slavery, but being captive or abusive relationships is complicated. People stay in situations that they don't always want to actually be in, that are as harmful for them, because human psychology is it's strange. We aren't logical beings. We don't make logical choices. So we can't say that just because somebody didn't leave their slave master, that they were loyal in the way that the lost cause myth likes to talk about this. That's kind of, working through one thing. You also had camp slaves that were generally enslaved by the Confederacy, so they were there in service not to one individual, but into the Confederacy. These folks served as the main manual labor of the Confederate Army. You did have some, but much smaller percentage of free blacks that enrolled in this. They were paid and everything, but it was a very small amount. But again, they didn't serve as soldiers or anything like that. And again, how do we know this? This is written in folks' diaries. It's written in the law. It's written even in the debate within the Confederacy of whether or not to have slave and black soldiers. This was the debate from the beginning of the war all the way up through 1965. Where near the end, it appeared they tried to create a regiment of black soldiers, but the effort quickly fell apart as the war was grinding to an end for them. No black regiment served in battle for the Confederacy. There's no documentation of a black regiment for the Confederacy. That's from primary sources. And it continues after the war, as pensions were being handed out. only those that served as camp slaves that were black could get a pension. Now, a lot of these folks that claim black soldiers fought for the Confederacy will point to this pension. But even in then, you look at the pension, they weren't ID'd as soldiers. They were ID'd as camp servants. That's what they're written down on. They didn't get soldier pension. They got less pension and were ID'd as camp servants. This is not my interpretation. This is not anything like this. It's not gleaning. This is written down in accounting documents, right? These are written down in state and county government documents on what they identified these black men as camp servants, not soldiers. We can't make something that they wanted to. Now, I don't want any black Confederate soldiers. That's my bias. But at the same time, if there was evidence of regiments of black Confederate soldiers, that is something that we would have to accept, because that's what the evidence tells us, particularly within documentation. If there's documentation of this black regiment served at this battle under this commander, there's none of that. Well, we have plenty of evidence of Union regiments. That's how we can compare these things. There's an interesting aspect to this as well, particularly with those that received a pension. Now, I should say at this time, this was during the rise and battle. The Daughters of Confederacy, the Sons of Confederacy were coming on board to present this lost cause narrative. It was a way to reinterpret their loss of the Civil War, which they felt was just. So there were aspects to this. One, it was saying it wasn't about slavery, but state rights and Union overreach, which is all BS. We know that's BS. The state secession letters and the Constitution of the Confederacy were explicit about the creation of a slave state and why they were attempting to form their own, slave state. It was about slavery. The central aspect of the Confederacy was about slavery. And as the war went on, again, why they didn't actually create and why black soldiers didn't happen, because we saw this in the debate, it would be an admission that the project of the Confederacy was faulty in its worldview, and that the natural state of things was subservient black people, that their natural state was being inferior and subservient to whites, and that their roles were menial and they weren't brave and down the line. Then all of a sudden, if you start arming them and putting them in the field of battle, and they're capable of bravery and leadership, capable of tactical and strategic thinking, something that your belief system doesn't allow, the entire project breaks apart. Because the antithesis of the Confederacy would be to have black soldiers. So again, as the lost cause myth grew, for folks that served as camp slaves to get a pension, they also had to embrace the lost cause narrative. They had to have, they would have to get witnesses and people to talk about how loyal they were to their master, how loyal they were to the Confederacy. And in fact, you had some camp slaves come in and take part in reunions of the Confederacy. Some of these became quite famous amongst the Confederate, reunions. They would, wear these uniforms, but again, they were only ID'd not as soldiers, but as camp slaves. Now, again, this is complicated. We might be able to see the long ago are, maybe a modern incarnation of like the Candace Owens of the world, right? Those that may have been true believers, or maybe they weren't true believers, but they understood this as an opportunity. Because if you supported the lost cause narrative as a black person that may or may not have been a camp servant, because there's not always evidence that these people were camp servants. Oftentimes you would get travel paid for you to go to these reunions, or you might receive money and fundraise, get money from these folks. They would support you. You'd get recognition. And it was also recognition of your own bravery, when oftentimes, particularly for men, you're called boy, you're lesser than. So as to show your manhood. Again, you have a intersecting a really interesting self-interest, of self-preservation within this. This is about not judging, but attempting to try and understand the thought process of why a black person might go in and actually support this lost cause narrative when it really might have just been self-preservation. And in fact, most of it probably is. And a lot of what we know about humanity, it really is just self-preservation a lot of these times. Now, some might have been true believers. Others might have just been playing a part to help themselves get along in a tough world. A lot of these folks were also held up as, World War I progressed, as the roots of the Civil Rights Movement grew. Soldiers would come back from World War I and wearing their uniform, having fought in combat, having been in cities that weren't segregated in France, wanting the same rights that they experienced abroad in the United States. While they were lynched, killed, and beat, they would uphold these former camp slaves as, again, part of the lost cause narrative, as to say, see, they know the natural state of things, that blacks are subservient to whites, upholding this idea, again, of white supremacy, the natural order. And again, this wasn't just Confederates doing some of this stuff. Warren G. Harding, presidents and all this stuff were upholding these lost cause narratives. This was a national narrative. Was that of the lost cause? It really became a national narrative. Eventually, things evolve. And as the civil rights movement progressed, you saw an academic pushback against the lost cause narrative, a recentering of not the loyal slave, but the black narrative of black soldiers in the Union being central to their own liberation, of slave rebellions, of Frederick Douglass being central to getting Lincoln to turn to emancipation. Central to it. And so then you started to see a pushback by the daughters and sons of the Confederacy, these neo-Confederates, supporting this lost cause narrative. They they basically created a, forget about right now, but had somebody write a book about this, which made a claim, unsubstantiated claim, that this camp slave, a famous camp slave, this guy Silas, was a soldier, again, without any evidence, without any context, without looking, that again, he was written as a camp slave. There's no documentation that this person performed as a soldier in any which way, shape, or form. The only evidence that they relied upon was a photo of him dressed within, a Confederate uniform. Maybe he had a gun, but historians and people that know this stuff said it was a prop for the photo. They ignore, again, the historical context of these things. Masters and slaves would often take photos together before they went on and, served in the Confederate Army. And a lot of these, again, were for posterity, for the owner to show the loyal slave, to show status, to all these things that we know happened. Eventually, these narratives grew, and really these folks fully embraced this idea. The internet helped spread this stuff through multiple websites. What they would do is literally just copy and paste the different photos and articles throughout different websites without putting any historical context, without referencing any direct sources or primary sources and the context and what was written. And in fact, some stuff was manufactured. There's a photo that often goes around of black soldiers that they claim are part of the Confederacy, but this is a doctored photo that is of black Union soldiers. And in fact, what ended up happening is they took out the white commanding officer and then did some other adjustments to it to make it look like Confederate soldiers. And the original picture is of black Union soldiers. Again, this narrative goes on and on. Now, there's a really interesting twist to this. And this is Henry Louis Gates Jr., apparently, due to some shoddy work of one of his colleagues, it's tough. So Henry Louis Gates, this is a really interesting thing. So he relies upon an article written and published on The Root by Harvard colleague John Stoffer. Kevin, the author, finds their approach, lacking. to say the least. Now, why is that? So John, wrote this, and he doesn't question anything. So there's so-called witnesses who saw black slaves dressed as Confederates. They were during the first battle in Manassas. A free black person that was served as a lookout for the Union said he saw black regiments. Now, as we look further and further into the documentation of the battle, there is zero evidence that a black regiment or regiments fought in the battle. No other witnesses corroborate this. And really what we can interpret it, particularly through documentation of that Confederate army, is that he saw camp slaves that he interpreted as black regiments. So let's think about this. We have one person that was a lookout said he saw black regiments. When you have all this other documentation of that Confederate army, of the people, of their own perceptions of that army, internal stuff, right? So primary sources, that doesn't say anything about a regiment or regiments, let alone regiments, of black soldiers that are serving the Confederacy. Now, there's evidence that they say black or camp servants and camp slaves, and their roles as camp servants and camp slaves. And then even then, we look at the battle itself. There's no documentation of the battle itself of Union soldiers encountering black regiments. So there's no supporting evidence of this claim. But John is uncritical of it. He takes this at face value and doesn't investigate the claim itself. Kevin investigates the claim. He digs into it pretty early on. He's like, okay, what happened here? And he looks further into this claim. Where's the supporting evidence for it? What did the Confederates there say and write? How did they view things? Because again, if we're, we have to view things how they engage with the world and what they said it was through their own worldview. They're saying blacks didn't fight. They would know. No, but there's also another claim that John writes about Frederick Douglass claiming and using this report of this battle to say there were black regiments and to scare Lincoln. Again, these were rumors, unsubstantiated rumors. There's no evidence of this, just rumors based upon this one report that was used to help push Lincoln to get black soldiers into the Union. That was it. I mean, there's more to what was written, but Kevin really breaks it down and says no. Even then, again, with some of the claims as, relies upon pension stuff and again, just doesn't dig, below that. He takes certain things and certain claims at face value and certain claims that really arose out of things like the Daughters and Sons of the Confederacy, such as Silas. Was the reason why Silas is so important is because he was awarded a Confederate medal of something that only soldiers could get. This happened years later, like 1980, right? 1990s. And shortly after, Silas's own surviving family was like, nah. And removed this from the gravestone. And so there's not there. It's not there. And it's not comprehensive. If you're looking for something comprehensive that really explores, this book really explores this. It's really quite interesting. There's also some illumination into the persistence of this myth, and it's really interesting reading their thought processes. And you can see echoes of these things today, particularly of this need of thinking of the docile slave, the loyal slave. We see this stuff in the narrative that particularly conservatives have to push forward, but some of this stuff isn't even left to just conservatives. If we see and really peer into the mentality of these folks, it's them needing to believe things weren't as bad as they really were, that they weren't the monsters, that they were just in their actions. And we see the same with moderates and liberals and how they view the United States. And how they view it isn't necessarily the lost cause per se, but it's the same type of cognitive dissonance that is happening and continues to happen that we fall into when we talk about really anything around racism, from policing to wider aspects of the justice system to housing and redlining and so on and so forth. How folks act in very paternalistic ways and think very paternalistically about black folks in this, well, if only we just show them the way, they just don't know any better. It's a cultural problem, so on and so forth. Things that were, some of these things and ideas were prevalent before the Civil War, particularly the idea of we need to teach them has always been prevalent. And then after the Civil War, we saw rise to, they just don't know any, that the cultural idea of the inherent black criminality, the breakdown of the black family. These narratives have been around for a long time, immediately after the Civil War, right? Like this is propaganda. It's lost cause propaganda these folks are spouting. They don't know it. Personally, I don't think that they actually want to know it. No, this, if you want to learn more, though, I suggest you get the book. It is very quite illuminating, and really I suggest anything that digging into Reconstruction around this area of from the Civil War to Reconstruction and the failure of Reconstruction is quite illuminating today, partly because we could draw a direct line from rhetoric to just the problems that we're seeing today from the failure of Reconstruction and the lost cause narrative and its propagation across the nation. Fortunately, historians in academia and museums are getting better. There was some issues with museums and some, like the National Park Service had some things that embrace the lost cause narrative, but these have been reversed of late, and historians have done a great job in academia pushing back against this, and there's really only one or two historians in academia that even really embrace this again, as we see. In really any way, shape, or form at any level. But the majority of historians strongly push back on this narrative, strongly push back with evidence, with supporting evidence, not just circumstantial evidence where they say, well, look at they got pensions and there's photos of them and there's this one witness without corroborating evidence. Well, they dig through this, like Kevin dug through this stuff, dug through it. And even within it and within the sources that he lays out, primary and secondary and research papers and all the books of other people that have dug into these things, lays out why there is no supporting evidence for this. And to the contrary, there is supporting evidence, that counters it, that destroys the narrative of Black Confederates. But the narrative is a persistent myth, and it's one that conservatives, particularly white conservatives, need to believe in because it reinforces their worldview of both of what they view black folks as well as the need to embrace the lost cause narrative because of what it says about them. If they don't, they have to be the good guys. That is it for this week at Finding the Warmth of Our Sun. I am Matthew Barngan, your host here at Masson365. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Stitcher, and Apple Podcasts. Thanks for coming, and I hope you have a good one.
This is 365 Media.